Asia and the Pacific is the region of the world that typically experiences the greatest number of internal displacements linked to disasters globally on an annual basis. In addition, there are statistics pointing to the possibility of tens of millions of people, potentially up to 90 million people, who may have to move in the future as a result of the impacts of climate change. Now, we have broad statistics such as those that I just cited, but what we don't necessarily understand to a sufficiently detailed degree is how many people are likely to have to move in the future and where are they living now. The reason that data like this is important is because it can help us underpinning activities, operations and activities and policies that can serve to prevent people from having to move in the sense of helping to mitigate the hazards and the other challenges that they face, and also in terms of enhancing preparedness over the short term in case of disaster to reduce shocks. So what we're really trying to do through the Risk Index for Climate Displacement, or RICD, is to enhance data systems and tools that will help us have a more complete picture of some of the risks that we might face in the future.
Disasters in the past decade have caused 225 million internal displacements in Asia and the Pacific, accounting for 78% of the global total.
My name is Michelle Chijic. I attended the opening of the launch of the project today, RICD. And this, for me, I would say was quite eye-opening. It was an opportunity to meet with people outside of my comfort zone, outside of the natural kind of interlocutors that I have on a day-to-day basis. And that included people from academia, from think tanks.
We're aiming here to dramatically increase the reliability and the granularity of data on the likelihood or the risks of people having to move in the future as a result of the impacts of climate change. In order to do this, we've enlisted the support of 21 expert institutions from universities to co-create or co-develop with us an advanced analytical model that will help us in understanding these risks in the future.
We have gathered many experts here to discuss the framework and methodology on how we can really understand the link between migration and climate change.
I think oftentimes we work in siloed situations, but really this is such a complex problem that we cannot be addressing it by ourselves.
Because my background is in data analytics and big data and artificial intelligence. So in this symposium, the domain expertise, they know the problem. They don't know how to solve it. Where's the data? How to build a model? How to estimate or evaluate the result? That's my experience can contribute.
We have a lot of experience in the region working for the community-based approach and helping government to develop the policies.
Coming here is important because I can learn from my colleagues, so I can take it back and customize it to suit the local context.
For us, this is not just talk. For us, this is an indication of our willingness and commitment to act. The Philippines was just elected a host of the LNDF board. And for us, we think that it's a step in the right direction.
The world is looking at us. The most vulnerable communities are looking at us. Not only the migrant and displaced community, everyone affected by climate change is looking at all of us to come together, academia, private sector, UN agencies, communities, member states, and operationalize what we talk about.
So I think today's event basically showcases and highlights the importance of thinking outside of the box, of thinking what we can do differently, how we can team up together and address and mitigate against climate change.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. A very warm welcome to the second episode of our Brown Beck webinar series, which is titled Between Flood and Flight, the Spectrum of Climate-Driven Mobility in Bohol's Coastal Communities. My name is Priyatma Singh, and I'm a lecturer and researcher at the University of Fiji. I'll be the moderator and your host for today's session. This webinar series is a collaborative initiative of the International Organization for Migration's Climate Mobility Innovation Lab, the University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, and the Asian Institute of Technology, along with partners from our co-creation hub. And our main aim is to raise awareness and facilitate dialogue on the various dimensions of climate displacement. In the first session that we conducted towards the end of last year, we had a presentation on disaster displacement indicators, drawing on the experiences of Indonesia and the Philippines in tracking displacement in disaster context. And for today's session, it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Sonali Manimaran, whose topic today is Between Flood and Flight, the Spectrum of Climate-Driven Mobility in Bohol's Coastal Communities. Sonali Manimaran is a PhD candidate at the Asian School of the Environment and the Earth Observatory of Singapore at Nanyang Technological University, where she investigates the impact of sea level rise on human migration and displacement across Southeast Asia. As a member of the Disaster Analytics for Society Lab, she applies a mixed methods approach, combining statistical modeling and disaster risk analysis tools with qualitative research to better understand the impacts of rapid and slow onset disasters. Her collaborations with the Philippine Red Cross, the UN International Organization for Migration, and the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center focus on applied climate migration research. Sonali also completed a fellowship at the Climate Service Center, Germany, where she led research on extreme heat projections for Southeast Asia. Prior to her doctoral studies, she worked in fintech and sustainable investments, and she holds a BSc in Environmental Earth Systems Science from Nanyang Technological University. All right, so to ensure a smooth presentation for today, we would like to remind all participants to please mute your mics during the talk. Thank you all, and over to you, Sonali.
Thank you, Priyatma. Just give me 1 second. I'll share my slides. Okay, thanks so much, Priyatma, the rest of the organizing team, IOM, UPR, AIT, for the series and for inviting me to present my research. And thank you to everyone who showed up for this talk. I hope it'll be useful, and I hope to have a nice discussion with you all after this. So today I'll be presenting the work that we did in Bohol in the Philippines, looking at various things, but one of them was the response to coastal flooding that the communities experienced there, and we looked at the mobility responses in response to the coastal flooding. But before I go into the study, I just want to talk a little bit about what has been the public discourse surrounding climate-induced mobility and displacement, migration, etc. So a lot of what we can see in the headlines are, I think, pretty bold claims, talking about large scales of mass displacement, mass migration. There's been talks of climate refugees. And looking at these headlines, it can be pretty frightening. It can be pretty concerning. But I think we have to take this with a pinch of salt. While it is true that the effects of climate change are going to be quite severe and it will affect millions of people around the world, I think we have to be careful in terms of extrapolating this to then say that will be a mass exodus of people from where they're living currently to neighboring areas within their own country or even internationally. I think especially when we see headlines like this, there can be quite a lot of resistance politically in terms of viewing migration as a positive for adaptation. And at the end of the day, I think that's what it is. It is a risk management strategy. And where we can, we should facilitate it such that it reduces risk and vulnerabilities and promotes resilience. And I think if we continue the discourse in this way, then it is difficult to get us there. When we think about climate-induced mobility, we have to be quite aware that it's a nuanced and complex process. So even within the consideration of climate hazards, they don't act in isolation. They often act with several other drivers, economic drivers, social drivers, political drivers. And with these interactions, there are several different outcomes that we can have with mobility. It's not simply whether people are going to stay, whether people are going to move, but there are many different dimensions. For instance, spatially, are people going to move within the countries? Are they going to move across countries? How long is that movement going to last for? Is it a short-term thing? Is it going to be a permanent thing? Who is the person that is moving? Is it going to be an individual? Is it going to be the entire household? And what level of agency do they have in making these decisions? Is it something that they can't control? They're being forced to do it? Or are they taking a longer view and planning ahead for managing the risk and choosing migration in that form? So to investigate these nuances within Southeast Asia, that's pretty much what we aim to do with this study. And it is part of the Southeast Asia Sea Level Rise program that is conducted by various research groups at the Earth Observatory of Singapore and Nanyang Technological University. And the objective of this project is to project sea level rise impacts within Southeast Asia, along with the processes. So the project also deals with creating projections of sea level rise for the region. But my work specifically in this program has been on mobility, and to date, a lot of that has been on modeling. So some of the things that we've done so far include creating displacement curves that link housing damage to the probability of displacement. And we've done this with the rich data sets that we can find published by various governmental agencies in the Philippines. We've also developed a probabilistic model of housing damage driven displacement risk. So from the impacts of sea levels and various coastal hazards, what is the risk of suffering housing damage, and then what is the risk of being displaced? But what a lot of these models cannot tell us is about the very nuanced dynamics that we would see, because while we are doing these models on a Southeast Asia scale, Southeast Asia scale is too large, and migration decisions are happening at a very, very small scale, often at the household or individual level. And across the field, we need to improve our empirical understanding of these dynamics, and that is what the study hopes to do. So the location we chose is Bohol, which I think, considering the audience most of you are familiar with, is in the Central Visayas region of the Philippines. And Bohol is a very interesting case study because of some of the hazards that it has suffered recently, which has kind of created an artificial sea level rise sort of situation. I'll explain what that means. So some context for Bohol has a population of over 1 million. Employment in Bohol is largely agriculture-led, closely followed by fishing. There is a substantial poverty incidence rate of about 20%. About a quarter of households don't have proper land tenure, and over half are without proper sanitation. So when I was talking about the artificial sea level rise situation that happened, basically in 2013, there was an earthquake in the island that caused land subsidence of a meter in the northern parts of the island. So basically, when this happened, the land sank and the sea level sort of rose because of the land that has sunk. And if you think about it, this is what future sea level could look like in many places, but this is sort of already happening in the northern areas of Bohol because of this land subsidence. And one other notable thing to mention is that in 2021, it was severely impacted by Typhoon Odette. And we'll talk a little bit about how the typhoon also factors into the coastal flooding and other risks. So for the study, we basically conducted household surveys, and we supplemented this with key informant interviews and focus group discussions. This study was not conducted in isolation. It was in collaboration with the Greening Disaster Risk Reduction program, which has been run by the Philippine Red Cross, where they aim to integrate nature-based solutions to reduce disaster risk. So in this pilot in Bohol, they were using mangrove planting as a way to manage the coastal flood risk. So what I'm about to present is part of a wider study that looks at the perceptions of coastal hazards in the island, the value of ecosystem services, opportunities for nature positive insurance, as well as the adaptation strategies of the communities, specifically their mobility responses. And I'll be focusing on the coastal hazards and the adaptation and mobility responses. So we basically conducted this study in 4 different municipalities across Bohol. As you can see on the map, 2 of them were in the south and 2 of them were in the north. And as I mentioned, in the north, these were the areas that experience quite a bit of land subsidence. And you will see how this then figures into the experience of flooding later on. We conducted this in October of last year, and essentially the way that we went about choosing these municipalities is that they have some degree of coastal flood risk. They either have mangroves that are already established or have the potential to be established, and we also look for variation in income levels across these municipalities. So unsurprisingly, we saw that most respondents told us that the 2013 earthquake increased coastal flooding. And if you can see from the graph, in Inabanga and Tubigon, these were the municipalities that were in the north of the island. And these were the same ones that reported much higher levels of increased flooding post-earthquake. Another significant finding was that virtually all of the respondents were affected by Odette. And you can see some from these graphs that, and especially the north, a lot of respondents reported that they had full-scale damage to their homes. And even in the south, there were full-scale damage, but quite a lot of partial damage as well. And many respondents indicated that they had quite severe losses to their livelihoods, especially those who were working in fishing or agriculture. And quite worryingly, quite a lot of people are still recovering from the impacts of this happened in 2021. And we were surveying them in 2024, and a lot of people were saying that they're still in debt due to the damage that they suffered from the typhoon. And in terms of the repair status of their homes, as you can see across all the municipalities, largely they were incomplete. And when we asked further, why have the repairs not been started or completed, the lack of funds was the most common reason. And we heard this pretty powerful quote from a barangay official in Batasan, that they were not drowned by the typhoon, but they were drowned by the debt. And this was a sentiment that was echoed across the respondents that we interviewed. And for certain, this will affect their resilience to any future hazards that they face. And in terms of the coastal flooding that is occurring in Bohol, there's a few different mechanisms through which this happens. First of all, we have flooding that occurs at every high tide. And so when tide levels are about 1.7 meters or higher, and this happens quite commonly, the water can reach knee or waist level in low-lying areas. And tides of 2 meters or more will result in quite more severe inundation. It can cover roads and even the first floors of some homes. Another mechanism through which coastal flooding happens is through the monsoons. So there are 2 main monsoon seasons in the Philippines. And you can see here that households report flooding in either the northeast monsoon or the southwest monsoon. And during the monsoons, you typically see stronger waves, you see higher winds. And this, even if you have regular high tides, it's going to add on pressures that lead to flooding. And if you have days with elevated tide levels plus monsoons, then you're going to have flooding that occurs for a few days. And as we saw with Odette, this will lead to far more extreme levels of flooding. A lot of the respondents that we talked to mentioned that the first floor of their homes was completely flooded, and they had to take refuge in the second floor of their homes. And some homes are completely wiped out. There's also significant wind damage that happens to their homes, as well as their boats, which is huge, which is huge for the fishing communities. And in terms of what the households are doing to adapt to this flooding, so we saw a lot of examples of them adapting in place. So some of these pictures show what the households have been doing. On the left here, you see that the coral reefs that were damaged by Odette, they have been excavated and now they've been using to construct seawalls. This is to keep the water at bay, but also to prevent further erosion. And we also saw that many houses have been elevated after Odette specifically. And this is well above the high tide levels. We also saw that there are some seawalls in these coastal areas, but from our discussions with the respondents, often they are saying that this is too low and it's only in certain parts of the island and not covering a large extent. And we also saw that there has been an increase in the planting of mangroves after Odette, and this was because areas that didn't have mangroves saw that they suffered more damage compared to areas that did have mangroves. So what the strategy has been post-Odette is that the communities with mangroves are trying to expand their cover, and the communities without mangroves are starting to establish them. But not all the areas are going to be suitable for establishing mangroves because you need a certain soil substrate. Typically, muddy soils work well, but a lot of the soil in the islands are sandy soils, which won't work for mangroves. And in terms of the mobility responses, oftentimes people are relocating temporarily to cope with typhoons. And this behavior has changed quite a bit post-Odette. So what happened during Odette was that there were several warnings that were issued. And because Bohol didn't have many experience with strong typhoons till Odette, they didn't think much of the warnings. Plus, the tide levels were not that high. And so they made a decision to wait it out. But, and then this led to pretty low evacuation numbers. And a lot of people ended up being trapped in their homes. And from this experience, now, whenever there is a warning issued, the evacuations are almost immediate, as you can see from this graph here, where we asked how have past typhoons changed your approach. Most people said that they now evacuate immediately. But one thing to know about the evacuations is that a lot of times men will often stay behind to look after their homes, their boats, while women, children, the elderly go to the evacuation shelters. So even when we think about evacuations, it's not across the entire household. And typically, once the danger has passed, the households will come back to their homes. And post-Odette, if you look at this graph here, this is reflected that most households are relocating temporarily and then they're coming back to their homes. There is some levels of permanent migration, but largely households are staying in place. But this is not to say there is no concern about the future hazards that they might face. And actually, there is a lot of awareness about the impacts of climate change and what this could mean for coastal flooding in the future. And they are aware that this is going to happen more frequently, it's going to be more severe. And they do wish to have safer living conditions and more stable sources of income. And as you can see from this graph, most people have indicated varying degrees of willingness to permanently relocate if sea level rise were to make their homes uninhabitable. And this is especially the case in Inabanga and Tuigon, where we saw that the flood levels were a lot higher. But with that said, there is still a lot of barriers to relocation. One of them being the heavy reliance on fishing for income. So if people were to move to places inland, this would make it a lot harder for them to earn a living through fishing. And it's hard to change their livelihood to something totally different. If that's something they've been doing all their lives, it's hard to completely reskill and do another type of job. And then we have to think about the availability of the jobs as well. And there have been plans by the government for relocation, but this still comes with a cost. And this cost is often not something that several households can afford. And there have been delays also in the construction of these relocation sites. So some of the households we spoke to, they're ready to move, but the relocation sites are not yet prepared. And so they have to remain where they are. And we have to be quite mindful of these populations that are at high risk, but are unable to move to places with lower risk and who might end up becoming trapped in these high risk areas. Another thing we observed was that the coastal flooding adds a pressure that feeds and increases existing flows of migration. So already there are a lot of children, youth who are moving away from where they're living for higher levels of education. So typically beyond middle school, they're going to other places within the province or other provinces. And certainly for university education, they're doing this. And if they then find employment in these areas, then they end up staying in those areas. Also because the livelihood opportunities available in Bohol are rather limited. And so they end up going to urban centers for better prospects. But this is also a risk management strategy because oftentimes the remittances that you get, that the parents get from their children, helps them to improve their homes, make them more resistant to flooding and so on. And we heard this sentiment among many parents that they want their children to have better lives. And so they wish for their children to move to other places with lower levels of risk, better opportunities to earn a living and so on. So you see that in many coastal areas, there's a gradual aging that happens, whereby it's the older generation that is still living there, and the younger generation has moved to other locations for work. So to wrap it up, we've seen from the study that mobility, it's multifaceted, multidimensional. We've seen short-term evacuations, but we've also seen more permanent out-migration. And it's certainly not just affected by the climate pressure themselves. There are many other considerations that lead to anyone deciding to move, including education, making a livelihood, and so on. And in terms of the adaptation strategies, we have seen a lot of in situ adaptation, and this certainly does boost resilience. But there are some things that you just cannot ignore, such as if you're reliant on fishing for your income and you're facing these flooding pressures, then your ability to earn an income through that is going to be constrained in the long term. And in terms of things to prioritize for policymaking, we can't just be addressing the climate hazards. We have to be thinking about the broader drivers behind these migration decisions. And certainly when we are planning relocation, we have to take into account practical livelihood options. So we can't possibly move a fishing community inland and say that they have to start farming. It's just not going to work. and funding support is critical, oftentimes lacking. We also need to think about the short-term impacts. So, for example, typhoons, we have to manage that short-term early warning systems and so on. But at the same time, we have to take a longer view and see that these pressures will build over time with rising sea levels and intensification of storms and so on. So we have to combine this short-term and long-term view. So quite a lot of information. If there is one thing that you remember from this presentation, I would just want you to remember that climate-induced mobility is not just a question of stay or go. It is quite a bit more nuanced than that. I want to thank the partners that we worked with for this project, the Philippine Red Cross, and our amazing team of volunteers from the Bohol chapter. This work would not have been possible without them. I also want to shout out my colleagues from the Asian School of the Environment, Dr. Marika Rabonza and Alina, and the communities for being so welcoming and generous with their time and enabling us to conduct this study. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sonali, for a very informative session and for highlighting and capturing the practicalities of climate-related mobility issues through yours and your team's research efforts. All right, so now I would like to open the floor for question and answer session. However, before we begin, there are a few housekeeping announcements. So please use the Zoom raise hand feature if you wish to ask a question. And once called upon, please unmute yourself and ask a question. And please do make sure to mute your mic afterwards. Otherwise, you may send your questions via the Zoom question and answer box or the chat service platform as well. Now, while we may prioritize direct questions, we will also address those submitted in writing via the Q&A or the chat box. And also to give everyone an equal opportunity to contribute towards the question and answer session, we kindly ask you to please limit your question to one. All right, so with that, you may now ask questions. The floor is open for a question and answer session now. Please feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I can see some hands being raised. Just give me a moment. All right, April, you may go ahead with your question.
Hi, I'll start with a question. This isn't strictly related to what you presented, but I was wondering if the local government of Bohol, of the provinces, of the municipalities you've studied, are they enacting policies already or projects, activities to help address the migration or displacement in coastal areas? And another thing I would like uh, to ask if the government necessarily sees this as a negative thing. Has your study touched on those topics?
Yeah, thanks, April.
Thank
So in terms of what the government has been doing to manage migration and displacement due to flooding, I think there are targeted efforts, for instance, in the municipality of Tubigon, where actually I kind of glossed over this, but I would like to show you again, just the locations that we're talking about. Okay. This is one of the islands that is off the coast of Tubigon. And as you can see, it is very much like on the water. And it's a little island, and there's really not much space where people can retreat to. So specifically in these municipalities, the municipal government has been prioritizing the construction of relocation sites, but as I mentioned, there are some delays in the construction, and also partially the cost of the relocation has to be borne by the community, and they're not yet able to do so. And in terms of the other municipalities, while there isn't a focus on relocation per se, there are initiatives to manage flooding risk through the construction of seawalls. But as we've seen, there's also more nature-based solutions that are being integrated, especially through mangroves. And there are early warning systems in place to alert people in the event of a typhoon, and there are regular evacuation drills so that everyone knows what to do in case of a typhoon. So I'd say there's like a pretty varied response in terms of what the government is doing to manage the risk. And I think the more severe the flood risk is, the more targeted it then becomes.
Thank you, Sonali. I hope that answers your question, April.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sonali. Thank you, April. Just to remind the participants, you may raise your hand to ask any questions, but I can see there are some questions in the Q&A box and the chat box. So I'll move forward with the question from the Q&A box. Sonali, there is a question in regards to gender dynamics. So the question is, in the context of climate-driven mobility and based on your experience, how do gender dynamics affect the vulnerability and adaptation in Bohol's coastal communities?
Yeah, so one interesting dynamic that we observed is the only partial evacuation of households during typhoons. So typically the men are staying behind. And if anything, this is increasing their vulnerability because they're more exposed to the risks, both the flood risk, the wind risk that they experience when they're staying behind in a typhoon. So particularly in a lot of these fishing communities, we've seen men shouldering more of the risk so that they can look after their property. Yeah, but I think more broadly speaking, there are other things that inform gender-driven vulnerability. So, for instance, does everyone know how to swim in case they are trapped in rising floods? This may not be the same across men and women, but I think the most concerning thing we've seen is that men are shouldering the larger risks so that they can take care of their property.
Thank you, Sonali. So, well, related to that question, but not so much on the gender dynamics, but here the question about future of Bohol's coastal communities concerning climate-driven mobility. So what do you foresee for the future of Bohol's coastal communities?
That's pretty tough to answer, and I feel like that's what we're trying to do with our research collectively, and suddenly with the RICD, I think that's something that we're definitely trying to get at. I think, as I mentioned, that's not going to be just like one response that we see in terms of mobility. There's going to be quite a large spectrum. And certainly with higher levels of flood risk, then the pressure to migrate becomes a lot higher. And I think this is also going to be influenced by the degree to which governments or other actors intervene and help with relocation. So I would say that it's certainly potential for outmigration to increase with the increasing flood risk. But we also need to be mindful that certain people may not have the ability to migrate and may end up being trapped.
Okay, thank you. And I think with our upcoming RICD tool, it might help towards understanding this climate related risks in a more like a better context to be able to then determine what type of actions to take at the ground level. I mean, I can relate to some of the case studies, similar case studies happening in the Pacific Island countries as well. So I really hope that this RICD tool that we are developing will help us to move forward in the case of climate-induced relocation and identifying related risks. Okay, so I can see some more questions in the Q&A box. So one of the questions here relates to factors like place attachment. Did you consider other factors like place attachment? And this is from an anonymous participant who mentions that I did my MSc research on small island communities in the climate change context. So looking for mobility and place attachment patterns vis-a-vis, and found out that a place attachment was a strong factor that immobilized the people or kept them in the islands. And this is something I have experienced as well with the communities in Fiji and some other Pacific Island countries. So what do you feel about that?
Yeah, this definitely came up quite a lot in the surveys and interviews that we conducted. And this is especially prevalent among the older generation there, who were saying things along the lines of, we were born here, we will die here. So I think that is a huge attachment to where they've spent all their life, quite a lot of attachment to their community as well. But then they also express that for their kids, they hope that they will not be subject to the same hardships that they faced. And so they wish for better lives for them. And they've expressed quite clearly that they hope for their children to find better work elsewhere, live in safer conditions, etc. So it seems that while there is quite a lot of attachment to where they're from and the communities, there's also recognition of just the dangers that flooding can bring, as well as the fact that livelihood options are just limited.
Thanks, Anali. And just a kind reminder to the participants to please mute your mics. There is a question in the chat box as well, Sonali, that is from Dr. Thana Lakshmi. She says, super interesting presentation, demonstrating mobility push and pull in Bohol. And I wonder if you came across tipping points to such mobility. Was there a specific push factor that forced people to move eventually? You mentioned income opportunities. Could that be considered a tipping point?
Yeah. So I think because of the way we conducted the study, we were talking to largely people who have stayed, right, instead of people who have moved. So I think that is a bit of a limitation in understanding tipping points. I think if we were to have surveyed communities who have moved, I think we would have gotten a much clearer view on this. But some things that we've seen are that as the flood risk increases, there is definitely more and more willingness to move. So especially in the areas that have undergone subsidence in the north of the island, there's a much greater willingness to move than areas in the south where the flood risk is not as high. But I think we also have to then consider, while there are pressures, what are the other considerations? And I think livelihood is a major consideration. If there isn't a viable option to earn an income where they are moving to, it's just not going to be feasible.
Okay, thank you, Sonali. And I think related to that, Niran Rak's question is sort of along similar lines. So if I would like to ask you that apart from socioeconomic factors being the root cause of evacuation, so do other factors such as community intimacy plays a huge role in influencing evacuation?
Right. I think with evacuations, we've seen that this is pretty much very ingrained into the behavior of communities, I think, especially through regular evacuation drills. And I think just also with the experience of having gone through several typhoons in the Philippines collectively, people are aware of the dangers and they do display propensity to evacuate. They are participative in the drills and so on. And I think especially in areas that have experienced typhoons directly, then their risk perception is a lot different. They are a lot more risk averse, and then they tend to evacuate. In terms of community ties influencing evacuation, I think certainly if a large number of people within the community are doing it, then it is more likely for you to evacuate. But we did hear things like preferences to go to family in other parts of the island rather than to go to evacuation shelters, because there are lots of people in evacuation shelters. There's concern for safety, for comfort, and so on. In general, if there are family members or friends that you can seek shelter with, I think that's preferred than to go to an evacuation shelter.
Okay, thank you for your response, Sonali. Just a reminder to the participants, you may still raise your hands if you would like to ask some direct questions. There are some questions still in the Q&A box that we can go ahead with. So, Sonali, there is a question about data gaps. Are there any significant data gaps in understanding the impacts of climate-driven mobility in Bohol? And if so, how can that be addressed?
Yeah, I think these data gaps are prevalent way beyond Bohol. I think across the board we have these data gaps, but not just data gaps, just gaps in our understanding of how this happens. I think we have not sufficiently looked at what is the influence of environmental drivers on mobility. And I think oftentimes we look at it in isolation without considering specifically economic factors into the mix. So I think we have to improve our understanding, and where possible, we have to speak to communities. I don't think there's any way around that. While we might use models to inform on a larger scale and understand and predict displacement on a larger scale, we can't bypass the fact that we need to improve our understanding on the ground, and we have to conduct more empirical research. And in terms of data specifically, I think a lot of data that we use now is through census data, and the time scale for this, it's 5 years. And we've seen that a lot of movements can happen on much smaller timescales. I think the Philippines does a great job in collecting data on this, because after every typhoon, there are damage assessments that are done on the level of damage that homes have experienced, and then subsequently how many people have evacuated and so on. That is very positive, but we don't still understand, let's say, permanent migration due to environmental pressures. And this study, we focused on people in the origin, not the destination. So it would be very interesting to look at urban centers like Cebu or Manila and talk to people who have moved there from these areas that experience the flood risk, and understand their decision making as to why they moved.
That's great. Thanks, Sonali. We have perhaps we can take another minute or so with the question and answers before moving on to the next session. So there is a question here on nature-based solutions. How can nature-based solutions and resilient construction methods be better integrated into long-term risk management systems?
Yeah, so we got to see quite a bit of this, especially because we were working with the Red Cross, who is rolling out this project to integrate nature-based solutions in managing flood risk. So there is an appreciation for the co-benefits that nature-based solutions brings, not just in reducing flood risk, but we see that it can improve fishing catch, for example. It can boost ecotourism. So if you construct a seawall, you're not going to see many of these co-occurring benefits. It pretty much just exists to hold the waters at bay. But if you have a mangrove, then it brings a lot more benefits. So there is quite a lot of appreciation and desire to implement this. And they are quite effective. Like we saw after ODAT that the areas with mangrove cover, they experience significantly less damage than the areas without. And communities have taken it upon themselves in many places to establish these mangrove areas. But with that said, there are limits to that. It's not, the magic solution. So the mangroves can only tolerate up to a certain level of water, and beyond which they are just going to deteriorate. They're not going to be able to be viable. And as I mentioned, the soil in which you're planting the mangroves, that's also an important consideration. Not every area is going to be suitable. So lots of areas you likely have to have a mix of both solutions. And where there are seawalls and other gray infrastructure, we have to make sure that they are matched to the level of flooding that the area is experiencing right now. It's just they're too low and they're not doing much to attenuate the flooding.
Thanks, Sonali. Maybe just one last quick question, and then we can move on to the next session. So this would be related to, again, the gender question. You answered about women's vulnerability and why men would like to stay behind. So in connection to the previous gender question, has your study looked into why movement in these communities seemed to be gendered?
We didn't do a deep dive into gender specifically. We did see that that this has been there has been a clear difference between men staying behind to take after property and other members of their family seeking shelter, but we didn't do a deep dive into this. And I think there might also be a gender dimension even in out migration in terms of like who is moving out to seek employment. We heard people saying that some men have migrated internationally to seek jobs working on cargo ships and things like that. And I think it is also observed in other places that men out migrate to look for work. Women don't necessarily do that. We didn't do a deep dive into this, but I would be curious to know what what lines you're thinking along of and what lines of questioning you think would be useful.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sonali. Sonali, there is one question in the chat box, and maybe we can answer that before moving on. There is a question from Prefecture Junior Bayor. May I know if in situ development is a right approach to resiliency?
Yeah, that's a good question. Also, okay, all right. Let me not let me just try to answer it without too many caveats. So I think that it is definitely better than not doing anything. So I think elevating your homes, for example, it's better than not doing that at all. So I think that is helpful. But as I said, with higher levels of coastal flooding, it may not be viable anymore to just simply elevate your homes, waterproof certain items, etc. At some point, you have to start thinking about maybe moving to a place that is safer. But even if you want to do that, then there are several barriers that you encounter in being able to do that. So yeah, you're right in asking that. There might be a little bit of a lock-in to the location you're in if you're just modifying your homes constantly and trying to manage that way. But I think, especially after the experience of ODAT, a lot of the coastal communities realized just how vulnerable they are. And it's unfortunate that that had to happen retroactively. But I think there's nothing more powerful than your own direct experience with a hazard for you to understand its implications. So I think after that, there's definitely a change in risk perception. But a lot of these communities need support. So in situ adaptation, a lot of times is the best that they can do. And to do anything else, they definitely need support from government or humanitarian organizations.
Thank you, Sonali. And I think that would be the end of our question and answer session. And thank you to all the participants for your questions and for making the session so interesting. And thank you, Sonali, once again for your presentation and for the responses to the questions. We were not able to address, I think one or two questions were left out, but please feel free to email your question to Ms. Sonali. As we approach the end of today's webinar, I would like to provide a very quick overview of some key takeaway messages from today's session. I think one thing that is quite clear from the session today is that climate-induced mobility is complex. And mobility in response to climate hazards is highly context-dependent and multidimensional, involving spatial, temporal, entity and agency-related factors, as pointed out by Sonali. The households in Bohol are significantly impacted by disasters, and so are making efforts to adapt through in situ measures like elevating their homes, seawall construction using localized materials, and planting mangroves. Now, these in situ adaptation strategies are perhaps one of the ways in which these communities are trying to adapt in their current location because of this reluctant nature to relocate. And I can draw some parallels here between Bohol's community and some of the coastal communities in Fiji that are also sort of going forward with the in situ adaptation measures simply because they do not wish to relocate due to traditional reasons, due to place attachment, etc. But of course, this does not fully mitigate the risks, as mentioned by Sonali. So I think it's, again, going back to my point, it's really challenging to navigate through this climate-induced relocation because every community sort of differs from each other. Temporary relocation during typhoon is common, but there is an increasing willingness to consider permanent relocation due to worsening flood levels. And again, it goes back to how the communities have experienced a particular disaster and their willingness to move to other locations. But this is not an easy feat because of the financial constraints or the reliance on local livelihoods, example, fishing. So it's difficult to imagine putting a community into a different location where they have to travel far to the ocean for their fishing. So putting a community into a different location with a new sort of livelihood also creates a bit of challenges. So financial constraints, reliance on local livelihoods, and delays in the government relocation initiatives are, I feel, significant barriers to relocation. And it is also alarming to note that some populations may become trapped in high-risk areas without external support. And it's important to understand that migration drivers are beyond climate situations. So, for instance, education, employment opportunities, and aspirations for better living conditions also drive migration. And again, I can draw some parallels here with Fijian communities who are, sort of encouraging their children to obtain better education and lifestyle and become more financially resilient to the effects of climate change and other related hazards. Coastal flooding does act as an additional push factor in such cases, with remittances from migrated family members helping to boost local resilience. And finally, today's session also reiterates the importance of relevant policy interventions. So integrated responses should really address both climate hazards as well as the underlying socioeconomic drivers of mobility. Relocation and adaptation support should really include practical livelihood options and robust funding mechanisms. And the risk management strategies should combine the early warning systems, nature-based solutions, and resilient construction to reduce immediate and long-term vulnerabilities. All right, so that was my very quick overview of today's session. So thank you, Sonali and everyone, for a very rich discussion session. And now, next up, we have a photo session. I would like my colleague to take over this session now.
Hi everyone. Can I ask you to turn on your cameras? So we have 6 or 7 panels. Please bear with us while we take the screenshots. First slide. Second. Third slide. Fourth slide. And last slide. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. So finally, I would like to thank you all for contributing to today's session. Now, a special thanks to Ms. Sonali for her presentation today. We now look forward to seeing you in future webinars under the Co-Creation Hub. Should you have any questions about today's presentation, please feel free to reach out to us or Ms. Sonali at the email address displayed on the screen. But before we close this session, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. So please take a moment to complete the evaluation form by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking on the link in the chat box. Now, once you've completed and sent in your evaluation form, once you've completed and sent in your evaluation form, you will then be provided with a certificate of attendance. Thank you.